Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek and I'd like to welcome you to the sixth and final part in our video series on the American Civil War, looking at the Northern Victory. Now the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, what key events helped the North win the war? So the first two battles we'll be looking at took place at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville in Northern Virginia. Now at Fredericksburg, the Confederate soldiers were set up in a very strong defensive position, which would allow them to repel the attacks of a much larger Union force. And then following their victory at Fredericksburg, General Lee would take his Confederate troops on the attack at Chancellorsville before the Union had the chance to rebuild its armies. So both of these were Southern victories, just kind of continuing the trend of the South being able to defeat the North in the eastern side of the war. But one major loss for the Confederates took place at Chancellorsville when General Stonewall Jackson was killed. It was actually after the battle. He and some men were going out on a patrol, and one of his own men saw them, mistook them for being Northerners, fired upon them, and actually hit Stonewall Jackson in the arm. Jackson had to have his arm amputated and then would die 8 days later from complications of the amputation. So while these were important victories for the South, they lost one of, if not the best, military commander that they had. Now, if you look at the Battle of Vicksburg, so we're switching back to the western side of the war, this was the last major Confederate stronghold along the Mississippi River. So it was a major target for the North because, remember, they had the goal of controlling the entire Mississippi River. And Ulysses S. Grant would lead a series of attacks on the city. These attacks would go on for months. And after 40 days of fighting and not getting any reinforcements, the Confederates at Vicksburg would surrender. And what this would do is it would give the North complete control of the Mississippi River and essentially cut off Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy. And you can see that here on the map. You can see Vicksburg labeled. And by the North gaining control of the entire river, those three states were isolated from the rest of the Confederacy. So this was a major victory for the North, cutting off three of the Confederate states through their victory at Vicksburg. Now, the other battle that's seen as a major turning point, and usually the single battle that's seen as a turning point in the war, was the Battle of Gettysburg. And this took place in Pennsylvania from July 1st to July 3rd of 1863. And what would happen is the armies of both the North and the South would actually meet by accident in Gettysburg, and the South took control of the battle early on. But the North was able to fight back, and on the final day of Gettysburg, Confederate General George Pickett would lead 14,000 men across a half mile of open ground to try and attack the North one last time. This was sort of their last chance to win the battle. But what happened is that these men were walking across open fields, so they were very easy targets, and nearly half of them were shot in the march. Those who were not shot had to retreat, and this was a major, major victory for the North because Gettysburg was a chance for the South to actually invade into the North. Remember, Pennsylvania was a Union state. But because they lost, the South had to retreat back to Virginia, and this would actually prove to be the last time that the South really was any sort of threat to invade land in the North. So the rest of the war after Gettysburg would just become about Northern troops driving the South back, closing them in. This was the last time the North really had to worry about going on any sort of defensive infighting. Now, following the Battle of Gettysburg, a few months after, on November 19th, 1863, there was a ceremony held to dedicate a cemetery for those soldiers who had died in the battle. And President Lincoln would give a 2-minute speech, which was called the Gettysburg Address. And this is one of the most important speeches in the history of our country, because remember that people were getting very weary of the war. They were getting tired of it. There was more and more call for negotiation with the South because so many men were dying, because it was taking so much time. But this speech would help Americans look past the war, remember their shared ideas, and remember exactly what they were fighting for. So a brief snippet from the Gettysburg Address was that Lincoln said, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced." So he's basically saying that whatever is said at this dedication will be forgotten, but the world will never forget the sacrifices that the men who gave their lives at Gettysburg and in the Civil War overall, what they gave their lives for. And he tells the people who are listening that it is up to them to continue to fight the same fight that all of these lives have been lost for, and remember the goal that they're trying to achieve. Just kind of reminding everybody why they are in this war and what is to be gained by continuing to fight. Now, if we go back to the western side of the war, remember that Union General Ulysses S. Grant did phenomenally well early on in capturing a lot of important areas to gain control of the Mississippi River. And in November of 1863, he would get another victory at Chattanooga in Tennessee. And at this point, he was made commander of all the Union armies. And what Grant did when he became commander of all the Union armies was he decided to attack the South on all fronts. So he said, we're going to use the Eastern forces to attack General Lee in Virginia, and then our Western forces are actually going to start to advance east toward Atlanta, Georgia, as a way of sort of closing in the South from both sides. And so he would command an assault on Robert E. Lee in Virginia that would eventually come to a head at Petersburg, and this would become a 9-month siege in attacking this single city. So in the East, there was this battle that was just waging for a very long time. But in the West, the Union was really looking to go on the offensive. So if you look here at the map, you'll see that Grant's plan was to have the troops who had just won victory at Gettysburg push south into Virginia, and then the armies that had been victorious in Tennessee were going to push down towards Atlanta and then eventually proceed to the East Coast and then eventually head up north to try and surround the Confederate army. So at this point, the North continued to win the majority of the battles of the Civil War. For example, in August of 1864, the Union Navy would gain complete control of the Gulf of Mexico by winning at Mobile Bay. And then in September, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, who is the gentleman pictured there on the right, would complete his goal of capturing Atlanta. You'll remember that was the first progression from the last slide on the map. And then through October, the Union forces who were fighting in Virginia continued to drive the South back. So Grant's plan was succeeding very early. Both parts of the Union Army were victorious in achieving their goals. Again, just driving the South back and taking over more and more land in the Confederacy. Now, this is important because during the first half of 1864, the North, as I mentioned before, was very weary of the war, and there was more and more support for negotiating with the South. And Lincoln was very determined to restore the Union. He wanted to see the country through this war that they had gotten involved in, but he was afraid that he would lose his bid for re-election because the war had become so unpopular, because he had taken a stance of attacking slavery, and it really was not looking very good for Lincoln early on in 1864. But the victories that we just talked about in Atlanta, Mobile Bay, and in Virginia helped sort of turn the mentality of the North towards the war around, and he began to gain more and more favor again, and he was actually easily reelected in the fall. So even though things didn't look good for Lincoln early on in the year of 1864, because of the continued success of the Union Army, he was easily the choice to remain president of the Union. Now, after he took control of Atlanta, General Sherman would begin what was called his March to the Sea towards Savannah, Georgia. Remember, the second part of his army's goal was to move all the way to the East Coast, wipe out all of the Confederate armies on his way, and then turn up north to sort of surround the remaining Confederates. Now, what Sherman and his troops would do is they would live off of the land and actually destroy anything in their path that would be useful to the South. So things like rail lines, livestock, crops, etc. And Sherman's army would cut a 50-mile wide path of destruction that was known as total war, and he and his troops would eventually capture the city of Savannah in December. And again, after capturing Savannah, they had reached the coast, so then Sherman and his men would turn north and continue their march up through South Carolina. So this brings us to a key term that I just mentioned, total war, which was the method of destroying anything useful to the South that was used by Union General Sherman during his march to the sea. Now, Grant would continue the siege of Petersburg, Virginia, during the winter of 1864, and he would finally force the Confederates to retreat on April 2nd of 1865. So an important, long, hard-fought victory on the eastern side of the war. And on the exact same day, Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, would also fall. So two major victories in one day for the North. And then after the falls of Petersburg and Richmond, Rebel General Lee would take his troops west because he was hoping to help stop General Sherman's advance coming up from the south. But what would happen is Lee would realize he had no escape, that there was nothing more that he could do. He had just run out of space and time. So he would surrender to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th of 1865 at a small Virginia village called Appomattox Courthouse. Now, Grant would actually allow the Southern men who surrendered to go home. He didn't ask anything more of them, and he would send 3 days' worth of food to these Southern troops because, remember, they were starving, they were tired, they were poorly supplied. So this was kind of a classy move by Grant during the surrender. Now, the surrender at Appomattox is usually seen as the final event in the war, but just a couple more things that would happen afterwards were that the Confederate forces in North Carolina would surrender to General Sherman as well, and then the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, would be captured in Georgia on May 10th. So in looking at the map, you can just see the troop movements of Sherman and Grant and just how much they had surrounded the Confederacy in these final stages of the war to the point where there really was no escape for General Lee. So in looking at results of the war, obviously there were major costs. 600,000 soldiers had died during the Civil War. There were billions of dollars in damages, mostly in the South, which laid in ruins. And the bitter feelings in losing the war would last for generations amongst Southerners. You've probably heard that arguments over Confederate flags and items are still being fought to this day. But the Union would be saved, and the federal government was now stronger than ever. And thanks to the Civil War, millions of Americans were now free due to the 13th Amendment, which had been passed in 1865. So we finish again with the guiding question. I hope you've enjoyed our video series on the Civil War. This has been Professor Blazek, signing off.